All right, Matthew chapter, stop, go away. There we go. Matthew chapter 18, verse 5 is where we'll start. Before we even get into that, though, some questions up front. You know, those of you who have kids, you know that how you treat my children is going to impact your relationship with me, right? How you treat my children is going to impact your relationship with me. The same is true of God. How you treat his children is going to impact your relationship with God. We should be very careful in how we treat other Christians, since they're children of God, and you're interacting with God's children when you interact with other Christians. I just thought that was, I read that in one of the commentaries. I just thought it was it's kind of a duh thing, but at the same time, it's kind of profound to think about. As you look around the room, what you're looking at is a bunch of God's children, and you need to be real careful in the way you interact with them, because if you hurt one of his children, he's not going to be happy about that. If you seek God's glory, you're going to seek the welfare of his children, right? The two are linked together. So what we've got is, and we started this really last week with the disciples. You know, they're having this argument and trying to decide who's the greatest, right? And Jesus talks to them about that, and you know, says that the greatest is going to be the humblest, the humility like a child, as we dealt with last week. But you realize that what he's dealing with in these disciples is they're provoking one another. They're provoking one another to sin, to bitterness, to rivalry, to jealousy. They're mutually causing each other to sin. And that's really what he's addressing here in these passages, is we've got to be real careful as we deal with God's children, as we deal with other Christians, because God is not only concerned about your purity, but about the purity of those that you touch and those that you impact, those that are in your sphere. And he's very concerned about the influence and impact that you're having on them, not just in your own life. I think we get sometimes, well, God's only worried about me. I don't have to worry about that. No, God's worried about all of his children, and particularly the children that you touch and the ones that you interact with. So that's really, honestly, that's the bottom line of the lesson today. So I kind of put that up front, but we'll get that as we go through here. So let's look at verse 5 to start. And I got to figure out how to, oh no. See, I've already messed up I can't read my notes anymore. Hold on. Sorry.
I didn't think you needed notes.
Yeah, you don't know me very well. All right. Verse 5, whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me, right? Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. So receives, it means who embraces them, who brings them in, right? So again, what he's saying here is whoever receives one of these little childs. Now, who's he talking about there? Who's the little child? I can't hear you. Yeah, believers, right? This is what we clarified last week when he's talking about this. The little child that's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He's talking about believers. Yeah, remember, we had this whole discussion about we are children. We are children in God's kingdom. We are children of our heavenly Father. So whoever receives a little one like this, right, like the one he described in verse 4, who has humility, right? Whoever receives this child, this Christian who has entered the kingdom of heaven, if you receive, if you embrace, if you love, if you cherish that child, that Christian, then you also receive me, right? So the big principle there is, when you do this to a Christian, when you act like this to another Christian, then you're doing it to Christ, and you're receiving him, you're embracing him as you do that, right? So we should take care of fellow Christians like their newborn babies, protect them, care for them, cherish them, help them to grow up. And then the big principle in this verse is you really can't separate the Lord from his people. If you go back to Matthew chapter 10 a minute, I do have a Bible here. It's just in the wrong version. So we'll try this and see what happens. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 40, you remember this verse. It says, he who receives you receives me. He who receives me receives the one who sent me. But the first part of that verse, right? He who receives you receives me. He's saying there's no difference between you and me. When they receive you, when they accept you, when they treat you in a certain way, they're treating me in a certain way. And just to give you some other verses, we won't look them up because there's no way I'm going to be able to find them. In Luke 10:16, it says, he who hears you hears me. He who rejects you rejects me. John 13:20 says, he who receives whom I send, i.e. the disciples, receives me. And then you know this great verse in John 14:20, I am in the Father, you are in me, and me in you, right? The oneness of the believer with Christ is fundamental to everything he's about to say. You remember even we talked about a couple of weeks ago when Paul was persecuting Christians and Jesus knocked him on the head on the Damascus road, and the question he had for him is, why are you persecuting me? Right? He didn't say, why are you persecuting Christians? Why are you persecuting them? He said, why are you persecuting me? I mean, in Christ's view, in God's view, we and Christ are one. We use these analogies in Scripture all the time, right? The vine and the branches, the head and the body. Again, trying to get us to understand the oneness that we have with Christ. The believer is one with Christ. And so again, how you're treating Christians is how you are treating Christ. Turn to Matthew chapter 25. There's this, many of you are probably already thinking of this verse. In Matthew chapter 25, beginning at 35. I guess we start at 34. Matthew 25:34 says, then the king will say to those on his right hand, come in, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, you looked at me. You looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in and you clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick in prison, go visit you? And the king will reply, I tell you the truth, whenever you did one for the least of these brothers of mine, you did it for me. Right? That is the principle that we're talking about here. Whoever receives one of these little children like this in my name receives me. Right, so that's fundamental to what Jesus is about to tell them as we go into the rest of it. So let's look at verse 6, back in Matthew chapter 18. Verse 6, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. So whoever, that means anyone, causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. Some of yours may say it causes them to stumble, right? It really is talking here about who is tempting, who is causing, who is aiding someone to sin, right? And what happens to them? We're going to go back to this, but it's better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck, he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Excuse me, there were two different kinds of millstones they used in that day. There was a millstone they had in their house that you would grind things up with, and then there was the millstone that was in town that was a donkey would pull around in a circle to grind up grain. This word is the mule millstone. Why I'm coughing like crazy right now, I don't know. Hold on. So this is the big stone. So he's saying, if you do this, if you act like this, if you cause one of these little ones to believe me in sin, it's better for you to be dead. Better for you dead than alive offending a Christian. So I think right here, he's smacking the disciples right in the face saying, hey guys, what you're doing by having this conversation is causing each other to sin. And it'd be better off if you were dead than cause another one of your brothers to sin. So let me just stop a minute and get this a little personal. How do we cause others to sin? What do we do that might cause our brother to sin? Any thoughts on that?
Gossip, talk about people.
And how does that cause them to sin? That's us
They-
sinning. I agree with that.
They're willing to do the same thing.
Okay, so we're giving them a poor example, i.e., we're giving them we're setting a sinful example for them. All right, what else?
I mean, ultimately, it's up to everyone's own responsibility for their own actions. But it's hypocrisy, supposedly living your life one way, and then, being in a bar, getting drunk or whatever. It's just your testimony. It's how you walk. I just remember my dad was a real big thing about that. It kind of turned him off on when he was a younger guy. And it just the hypocrisy and some of the things he saw in church kind of turned him off when he was a young guy. But
yeah, absolutely good, Tom. And I think, but let me push a little bit on something you said, and that is, everyone's responsible for their own sin. Yes, absolutely agree with that. However, what Jesus is expanding here and saying, it is also a sin if you entice someone else to sin. That is also a sin. You don't do the sin, but somehow you got them to do it. That's a sin in and of itself. Both are sins.
Hey, Rich, this is just a little bit off topic maybe, but when he's talking about, children and the kingdom, I think it's, possible too for us to maybe, wrong, but to look down on people who, just jump into the face so easily and don't seem to study all these things and know all these things. And we can, I know my own mind, I can become like a Pharisee at times where I'm like, well, they don't understand this or that. They're just, and, then I'd realize that, maybe I don't understand. I need to act more like a child and be more, but, it's easy. I think it's sad, but I think sometimes the longer we're in the faith, it's easier to look down maybe a little bit on people who don't understand all these things, all these theology and all the, the things that we're studying, who just say, I just want Jesus. And, and that's what we shouldn't look down on them. But I think there's, in our hearts sometimes, I don't know if anybody's like me, but sometimes I find myself thinking, well, they're just, they're just too simple for them or something. You know what I mean?
The ways that we
can
look down on people are innumerable, right? we try to think of every reason we can as to why we're better than everyone else, whether it's the way they look, the way they dress, their background, color of their skin, their attitude. They're not as smart as we are. They didn't go to the same kind of school as we did. They don't have as much money as we have. We do a lot of things to make ourselves feel better about ourselves, and in doing so, exactly as you're saying, Hugh, we are putting them in a position where they are then feeling like they need to provide retribution for that, right? They have to respond in some way. Yeah. So the way that we act towards people and the way that we set ourselves up above them can do the very same things.
Yeah, thank you. You said that much better than I did. So thank you.
I just generalized what you said. That was good. All right, so let me put these in categories a minute. So, how do we cause other people to sin? The first way is directly tempting them, right? Inviting others to sin. And we got to be careful with this because, and by the way, this verse is to whosoever. So it's not just Christians, it's also non-Christians. So that the categories are broader than just Christians. But so this is anyone tempting someone to sin, whether they're a Christian or not. that he's telling them not to do that. And certainly the world is tempting us to sin, right? By what we see, what we hear, the things that are put before us. But we also have to be careful about the things that we invite people to do, right? Whether that's a party, a movie, a situation that we might put people in that would cause them to sin. So directly tempting them, certainly. The second way is kind of indirectly, which is more like provoking, which is what we talked about here for the last few minutes, right? It's a lack of caring, a lack of concern, such that in Ephesians it talks about not provoking your children, right? Then the point is, because we don't want them to react towards that provocation. We don't want them to respond in anger. We don't want them to respond in wrath, right? Because of what we're doing. So, or treating them with contempt, or treating them with reproach, such that they respond in bitterness, they then have a bitter attitude. They then have an angry attitude, which is sinful, and they're doing it because of the way that we're treating them, which kind of generalizes what Hugh was talking about there. And then, as you guys said, I think setting a sinful example, absolutely, right? We're supposed to have a life that people can look at and want to follow, not they look at it and go, oh, well, if he can do it, then certainly it's okay for me. If they're allowed, they think that's okay, then it's okay for me. The other thing I would say is connected with both of these is kind of abusing our liberty, right? I've said before, and I firmly believe that there's only one rule, and that is trust God and do whatever you want, right? Trust God and do whatever you want. So we have the liberty to do whatever we want. However, if we abuse that liberty such that we stomp on other people, and you know where this comes from, go to Romans chapter 14. See what it looks like in this little Bible that I have here. Romans chapter 14. Romans 14, verse 1 says, accept him whose faith is weak without passing judgment on disputable matters. One man's faith allows him to eat everything, another man's whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The man who eats everything must not look down on him who does not. The man who does not eat everything must not condemn the man who does, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge someone else's servant, i.e. God's servant, God's child? To his own master he stands or falls. He will not stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. Jump all the way down to verse 19. Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace, to mutual edification. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. All food is clean, but it is wrong for a man to eat anything that causes someone else to stumble. Right? We talked about this a week or two ago. Right? Are we offending someone by what we're doing, by what we're eating, what we're drinking? It is better not to eat meat or drink or wine or do anything else that will cause a brother to stumble. Right? So if someone looks at you and they go, wow, I don't think Christians are supposed to do that, and you're more mature, well, it's probably okay. This is not really a sin, but because it may cause them to stumble, God's saying, don't do it. Step away from that. You're letting your liberty hurt your brother. I think that's something we got to really be careful about and think about. The last area I would say that we haven't talked about is failing to lead to righteousness. Right? We have a responsibility to our brothers in Christ, and it's all over the scripture, right? It says, stimulate your brother to righteousness, encourage them to righteousness, edify one another, stimulating them to love and good works. So part of how we cause others to sin is really to fail to strengthen them, to fail to encourage them, failing to support them. When someone reaches out and stretches their own faith, sometimes our response is, oh boy, he's going to fall down on his face. Or oh boy, he's setting himself up for failure, rather than encouraging, rather than praying with. When someone's putting it on the line for Christ, are we supporting them, encouraging them, praying for them, making sure we've got their back? So Jesus is saying here, if in any way that we're causing others to sin, it'd be better if you were dead. It's a pretty strong statement, but it goes back to this thing I said at the beginning. These are God's children you're messing with. You're messing with God's children. If you cause one of them to sin, he's not going to be happy. And he says here, it would be better if you were dead. Any thoughts on that before we go on?
Rich, I was thinking, it kind of, I think, goes into some of the categories that you talked about. I think sometimes it's just because we do nothing. We're just complacent about, other people's sins and we don't go to them in love. And I just think that enables them to, and makes them think that what they're doing is okay, when sometimes our sin is just because we do nothing. We're too apathetic.
Well, that's really good. That's a really important add. Thank you for that. Absolutely. And we justify it with, well, I don't want to hurt his feelings. I don't want to break the relationship. I don't want to da. Meanwhile, there's somebody in sin who needs to know about it, right? Of course, you got to do it in love. You got to do it in brokenness. You got to do it in tears. But absolutely, thank you for that. Anything else there?
So I would say it's a difficult situation there, because what you just read in Romans, do not judge the other guys and what they're eating and what they're doing. And we're not supposed to be doing the eating and doing that, but we're not supposed to judge the others. So it's a fine line of where you go and say, hey, you're not supposed to be drinking that thing. You're not supposed to be eating that stuff. You're not supposed to be saying that. But we don't want to be complacent.
Right.
So I think what we do is we do fall back on the complacent part, trying to be safe. And I'm not judging. I'm not going to say anything. You're right. Like you just said too, about don't want to break that relationship. I got a friend that's doing such and such. And, I've actually been in the situation with him, with friends who've gone off with other women. And, it's difficult.
But I think he was talking about the gray areas more in Romans, the things that aren't specifically right and wrong. Whereas
That's right.
like, the example you.
That
just
particular example. though.
Yeah, that particular, I
Yeah.
mean, some things are
But there's others.
blatantly,
Yeah. Sure,
contradictory.
that one's easy.
right, but some of them aren't, and that's where it
Yeah.
gets harder, the gray area, but.
Yep.
I think that,
And it goes back to, why would you confront anyone? It's not to, because sometimes we do the opposite. When someone sins, we just throw them out in our head, right? We just, well, they're no longer, I can no longer be friends with them. Like they are, rather than realizing what Jesus wants us to do is bring them back, right? Bring them back into the fold, help them to learn. And either ignoring them because we don't want to hurt them, or ignoring them because we don't want to deal with them anymore. Both are wrong. So yeah, but those are tough. I don't disagree. But as Melody has said, Romans is really talking about those gray areas, not the ones that are clearly sin.
Struggle with one, so it's a gray area that I struggle with friends of mine who are believers that will talk like they shouldn't talk. I mean, they use some words and they use some language, and I'm always struggling. So I'm not good friends with most of those folks, but I'm friends with them. And should I say something, or as soon as I say something, I'm judging, and I got some buddies that they're believers, but I'm surprised at what they will say. So.
And the only way that I've dealt with that in the past, CT, and is to let them know how it impacts me. Right? It's not about you're doing this and it's wrong, but I want you to know what that does in my heart, what that does as I hear that, how it impacts me personally, so that it's not some generic rule that we're asking them to follow, but rather it's about our relationship again, right? This when you say that, it hurts me. It causes me, a pain or whatever it is. So if you can make it personal, I find that is a little bit more less harsh for them. It's
You're not
about
so
the
much
relationship again. Yeah.
as you are taking it back on yourself.
Okay, so that's good. Let's keep going then. By the way, I think I have like 1.5 lessons here today, so we'll see how far we get. Verse 7. Let's see. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to sin. Such things must come, but woe to the man through whom they come. Right? First of all, woe to the world. The world is cursed because of these offenses, because of these leading people to sin. The world is a mess, right? The misery in the world is a result of sin and us causing people to sin. So that's the first statement. Then he makes this statement: such things must come, right? In other words, this world is still under the control of Satan, right? So that stuff is going to happen. The world is cursed. It will always offend. But he says, woe to the man through whom they come. In other words, make sure you're not that man. Make sure you're not the one through whom this sin happens, through whom this offense is given. Don't be that one. And that's, again, he's smacking the disciples over the head, saying, stop being that one, right? Don't be the one through whom this offense comes, because they were doing that. And so this is a little hard for us. It's like, no, God, why don't you just stop it everywhere in the world? No, it's up to us to stop it in us, right? Yes, it's going to happen in the world. Yes, that's the reality of the world that we live in, But he says, don't you be that one who does it. All right, verse 8 and 9. So verse 8 and 9 is, okay, so how do we prevent this from happening? Seems pretty straightforward. Verse 8 and 9. If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better for you to enter the life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands, 2 feet, and be thrown into eternal fire. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into the fire. So Jesus actually used this little parable earlier, back in chapter 5. But here, the thing I want to make sure you see is in verse 8, when it says, if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, the sin that he's talking about there is the sin of causing someone else to sin. Okay? The sin that he's talking about in 8 and 9 is the sin of causing someone else to sin. Jesus is trying to raise the bar here. Again, it's not just about your sin, it's about how you are causing others to sin. And so he's saying, if you are causing others to sin by your hands or your feet or your eyes, then cut those things off. In other words, if there are things that you are doing, right, that are causing others to sin, and you don't think that's a bad thing, it's not a bad thing you're doing, but somehow it's causing someone else to sin, right? There's nothing bad about your hand or your eye, but if it's causing someone else to sin, then you need to stop doing that, right? You got to not do that anymore. Even if the most enjoyable thing that you do causes another Christian to stumble, you got to get rid of it. If there's something that's in your life that's causing someone else to sin by them watching you, by the way that you're interacting with them, by the way you're pushing them in a certain direction, in the way that they're reacting to you, in the way that you're not encouraging them, you're spending all your time on your little stuff, but you're not spending the time encouraging them, helping them to move forward. He's saying there, here, cut it off. Stop those things. And I would just ask you to ponder a minute, what's on your list? What's on your list of stuff that you're doing, not doing, that is causing others to sin? I'm not asking you to tell me what's on that list, but I'm asking you to ponder in a minute. What are the ways that I am causing others to sin, pushing them towards it, not encouraging them away from it. That's worth some prayer time and thought on yourselves. Okay, verse 10. See, without my own Bible, I don't have my other random thoughts that come in and slow me down. So I'm actually going pretty quickly here. Verse 10. See that you do not look down on one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. So first of all, notice that he starts this off with, mine says, see that. Some of yours will say, take heed. He's saying, pay attention or be warned. Okay, I be warned. Do not look down on these little ones. Do not look down on other Christians. And we were talking about this a little bit ago. Do not look down on those that are not as smart as you, not as talented as you, and you're perceiving these things, right? That somehow you're better than they are because they're poor, they're handicapped, they don't smile like you do. They're dirty. Whatever it is, he's saying, don't look down on any one of these little ones, any one of these children. You've got to value all of God's children because he does, right? Don't look down upon them, look in disdain. They're not from my tradition. They have more needs than I have. And he's saying, you're not to look down on them in disdain. These are God's children. And the disciples certainly were doing this as they were trying to figure out who's the greatest. They're trying to put other disciples down by doing so. He said, not one of these little children. God cares for all his children, and he cares for all of his children the same. You and that other guy. One in Luke chapter 10, verse 19, it says, he that despises you despises me. So again, if we despise other Christians who are not like us, who are not as important as we are, not as cool as we are, you're despising Christ. All right, so let me take a minute on this. How do we despise others? We've already talked about some of these. One is, again, flaunting your liberty, right? They're not as mature as me. Looking down on the lowly. Maybe withholding what they need and consuming it yourself, being stuck in materialism. Again, not supplying what someone else needs in the body. We're one body. Thinking upon their physical features, maybe mocking their appearance, their way of speech. Again, as we talked about earlier, we're despising them if we allow them to fall into sin and we just reject them and throw them out and say, well, he sinned, therefore he can't be in our fellowship anymore. We just leave them out. And certainly if we use others for selfish gain, profiting from their loss, well, if he's not here, then I can be in charge. If they're not there, then I look more important, right? All of this is despising others. And then the question is, why should we not despise others? Look at the rest of this verse. For I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. Now, let me say one thing about this verse. This verse is often misused to make the premise that that children have a personal angel, right? Because they think that when we talk in here about little ones, that we're talking about children, and he's saying that each child has an angel, and each child has a guardian angel, and that's what this is talking about. And now, first, you know that this is not about children. This is about the same little ones we've been talking about for the whole rest of the chapter. He's talking about Christians. So he's saying here, Christians have angels in heaven. Christians have angels in heaven? Somebody, because my Bible is broken, somebody go to Hebrews chapter 1 and read verse 14, please.
What was that again?
Hebrews 1:14. Anyone?
Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation?
Read it again, please.
Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation?
And so who are those who will inherit salvation?
People, Christians, but people.
Christians, right? So he's saying here that the angels are sent out to minister to the heirs of salvation, to Christians. So what Hebrews is saying here, there are angels whose job it is to serve Christians. So that is exactly what Matthew is referring to here in verse 10. I tell you that there are angels in heaven who always see the face of my Father in heaven. All right, so let's go back to that. He's saying, listen, don't look down on Christians. Why? Because there are angels in heaven whose job it is to minister to Christians, to take care of them, who watches over them, who have concern for them. Now, what this does not say, just to be clear, this does not say that every person has a guardian angel, but it does say that there are angels whose responsibility it is to watch over Christians. My point there is, I don't think each of us needs our own. Angels can handle more than one of us. They are heavenly beings. But there are angels whose job it is to minister to Christians. So the other thing that's interesting in this picture, it says these angels always see the face of my Father in heaven, right? They are right there in his presence. This means, obviously they're holy angels. They're right in the face of God. One of the commentaries, I like the way he said it. He says their job is to watch God's face and see if any sense of concern comes across God's face while he's looking at you. And if there's any sense of concern, that angel's job is to go down there and work on it, right? To comfort you, to help you, or to discipline you, right? It's very interesting to think about what are the role of angels, our angels. We have angels in heaven whose job it is to minister to us on behalf of God. And that's what he's saying here. He says, don't despise these little ones. There are angels paying attention, and they're watching to make sure that we are not looked down upon, that we're not despised, and they're going to do something about it. Any comments on that verse before I go forward? I know it's a little bit different. You're good? Okay. Then we'll finish up verse 12 through 14. Verse 12 says, what do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 in the hills and go look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, I tell you the truth, he is happier about the one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. So here you see a picture of, again, we're trying to answer the question, why should we not despise these little ones? The first answer is they got angels watching over them. You better watch your back. If you are despising another Christian, there are angels who are going to respond. They're going to respond to help that one, and they're going to respond to discipline you if needed. The second reason is God. Let me ask this question. When a shepherd is out with his sheep, he's got 100 sheep, he loses one sheep. How does he know that one sheep is lost?
Because he knows his sheep.
He counts.
No, he doesn't count. He knows. He knows the sheep. He knows that little runt, right? That little one with the gray speck. That little one that's always rubbing his nose in the grass, that little one that rolls over too many times. He's not around. Where is he? Right? He knows his sheep. He's not counting. He knows his sheep. So the picture here is exactly the same for us. Why should we not despise little ones? Because God knows his sheep. God knows them. He loves them. He knows them individually. He cares for all of his sheep, and therefore so should we. Right? And the picture here is a Christian who wanders off into sin, who wanders off into trouble, right? God knows that. God's sending angels to help, but we ought to be paying attention too, right? We ought to understand that that's someone who needs help. That's someone who needs attention. The other picture that comes to my mind here is when we get to heaven, we have this, I have this picture of heaven. There's God up there on the throne. There's billions of us, right? Kind of worshiping him. But the thing that's pretty cool about this picture is God's going to know me when I get there. He's going to know me personally, right? It's not like I'm just one of a billion, one of 20 billion, right? He knows me individually. And I'm going to have a relationship with him in heaven. I mean, that's different. So God is a God who is seeking the sheep, forgiving the sheep, rejoicing with the sheep when he comes back. And finally, let's wrap it in verse 14. It says, in the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost. So let me give you the Rich Antcliff interpretation of that verse. And I got to tell you, there are others. But the Rich Antcliff interpretation is God's will does not allow one of the little ones to perish, regardless of the offenses against them, regardless of what you do to them to help them to sin. God is going to protect them. God is not willing that any of his little ones should be lost. His little ones. So here's the thing. If you believe in once saved, always saved, you have to believe that none of these little ones will ever be lost, right? That no Christian will ever be lost, will never fall into sin and lose, right? And lose his salvation. There's no such thing. So I think that's exactly what this thing is saying. The same way your Father in heaven is not willing that any of his little ones, any of his Christians should be lost. That's the Rich Antcliff interpretation. It's not the only Rich Antcliff, but there are other interpretations of that verse. All right. That's where we are today. The thing that, again, I was really impacted by this thought of, as I look around the room and around the computer there, every one of you is a child of God, and I got to be really careful of how I treat you. Because how I treat you is a reflection of my relationship with the Lord Jesus, is a reflection of what I think about him, how important he is, what I would do for him, what I would not do for him, what situation I would bring him in, what situation I would not bring him in. All of that is wrapped up in verse 5, really, right? Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. So there you have it. Any other thoughts on this?
Where is verse 11?
Somebody noticed we skipped over verse 11. I was waiting to see. So what's funny is in my New King James Version, there is a verse 11. And in this, I'm looking at my daughter's Bible, which is an NIV. There is no verse 11. All right, so who has a verse 11? Why don't you read it to us? Who has one?
I'll look it back up. It's the
So I have it.
about he has come to save.
For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost.
Right. So this is one of those verses that in the older versions, the more trusted versions, that verse does not exist. The verse does exist in Luke. Okay, this is a verse that is in Luke, but it appears that someone has inserted it here as verse 11. It certainly fits okay, but it is really it kind of breaks up the story that we're telling from verse 10 to verse 12 about the children. But you certainly can add it to the why list. Why why not despise? Well, because Jesus has come to save those children, right? Jesus has come and given his life for those children. So certainly, angels are watching over them. Jesus has given their life for them. God loves them. Those are three pretty strong reasons to not despise the children. But it is one of those verses that there's controversy over whether it should be there or not be there. So that's why it's not in some of your versions in others. Thanks for bringing that up. Because I was looking at this one, I skipped right over it. If I'd had my Bible, I would have said something. Any other thoughts on this? Is it just me, or does anybody else feel like, gee, I've got to be better in the way that I interact with other Christians? Just me?
Always. Been around the non-Christians.
Yeah, we're not even talking about non-Christians. We're just talking about Christians here. Yeah,
You know, the non-Christians are watching how we treat each other.
you
So
bet,
if
you
we're
bet
not-
your booties. Yep.
What's the point?
Yep.
I think on the other hand, on a positive note, it makes me feel very comforted to know how much God cares for me. And, you know, I have angels watching out for me.
Yeah, that's good. All right, Hugh, I think I saw you there, right?
Stop the recording.
No, he's not here.
He's hiding now. All right,
Stop the
sir. Stop the recording. As far as prayer requests here, stop the recording. I'm trying. As far as prayer requests here, so we're down here with Patricia